Today, I'm going to be installing H&R Sport Springs on a 2017 Mk7 Golf Sportwagen. So I just picked up some H&R Springs for the Golf Sportwagen to help get the suspension a little bit more in line with the Stage 2 tune and the 3-inch downpipe that we've previously installed. You can check those videos out on the channel as well. Installing springs is no small task, but with a little bit of practice, some time, some hard work, and the right tools, it can be done pretty easily. So let's get started. Here's a shot of the Sportwagen before we got started at its stock ride height. So when installing these springs, I wanted to start with the more time-consuming portion, which is the front two. So obviously I had to start by jacking up the front end, doing both the passenger side and the front side, and putting them on stands to get started. For this install, I'm going to be performing on the driver's side. You shouldn't see any difference from the passenger to driver's side. Here's about where I'm realizing that I'm bummed I've already gotten started, because I wanted to do a measurement of what kind of drop we saw in actuality once these went on, but unfortunately I didn't take those measurements before we get started. My first step was to remove the little spring steel clip that holds on the trim piece on the top under the hood to access the bolts that hold on the strut. I just loosened those up just a little bit. Next, I removed the end link from the strut using an open back socket and a triple square bit. This will help relieve some tension from that. Next, I removed this pinch bolt using a 14mm triple square bit and an 18mm socket. Next, using a triple square, a universal joint, and some extensions, I removed all the bolts holding the drive shaft onto the transmission. Next, remove the 3 nuts holding on the ball joint. Here's where I had to get a little bit creative because I didn't have a strut spreader tool. So actually using a 1/4 inch socket adapter, you're able to wedge that in between the strut, turn it about a 1/4 turn, and get that to loosen up, and you'll see it drop down a little bit. Now here's where you have to wrestle with the entire hub assembly in order to get it to drop off the strut. I found that pulling on it from top to bottom and also supporting it with a jack was the best way to get this down, because you definitely don't want that to fall with all your brake lines and any other lines connected to that, because you will definitely tear or stretch them out. Fortunately, there was so much wrestling and playing, I forgot to capture the actual part where I got it off, but you can see finally got it out, and it's supported with a cinder block underneath. Head back to the engine bay and remove the 3 bolts that hold the strut in place. And then once those are out, you should be able to remove the strut. Now time to disassemble the strut. Here I'm using spring compressors, which can be a little scary. Don't go out and buy these. You can go rent these from most local automotive stores. I got these from Advanced Auto Parts. The goal here is to compress the spring far enough so that way it's loose and no longer putting pressure on the top. Next, remove the top nut that holds the strut together. For this, you'll need a 21mm socket. If you have air, you'll be able to get that out just by using an air tool. Otherwise, you'll need an Allen key in order to hold that still. After that, disassembling the strut is pretty straightforward. Take off all the pieces and components, and then finally remove the spring compressors from the stock spring. Alright, here's the fun part. It's time to put your new springs on your existing struts and shocks. So to do that, you're going to want to grab a front spring, obviously, from the package, and make sure the letters, at least on these H&R Sports, are facing up when you put it on. Now put the rest of the components of your strut back on in the reverse order that you took them off, and make sure you don't forget anything. As you can tell, that little yellow piece to the left of the strut is the bump stock, and I forgot to put that back on. But don't worry, I did go back and place that in there. I just did not get that on camera. Put your newly assembled strut back in place using the 3 bolts in the top of the engine bay. Don't worry, you can't screw this up because the distances between those 3 bolts are not equal, so you will have to make sure you get that aligned properly before they're all going to bolt right up. Carefully slide the hub assembly back on the strut and get your pinch bolt in place. Once you got it all the way on there, I'd like to go and tighten that pinch bolt up just slightly to to make sure it's not going to slide back down on you as you start to get everything else bolted back up. Go ahead and get that drive shaft back in place and bolted up using your triple square. Go ahead and get that end link back in place. And the final step, make sure you go around to all the bolts and make sure they're torqued to the VW specs. That's it. Get that car off the jack stands once you got the wheels back on, and then let's head over to the rear springs. For the rear springs, I use the same process of jacking up the car and putting it on jack stands and doing both the driver's side and passenger side at the same time. Remove the nut for the bolt that connects the end link to the control arm. Then remove the nut for the bolt that holds on the gas shock. And finally, remove the nut that fastens the bolt for the hub assembly. Now each of these bolts are going to be held in by quite a bit of tension because of the stock shock. So you grab your floor jack, slide that underneath, and use that to support the control arm and move it up and down until you find each of the spots where these bolts are going to want to slide out or come out a little bit easier at least. Once you've successfully removed all of these bolts, you'll be able to drop the floor jack nice and slow and then pretty easily grab that spring right out of the control arm. Alright, it's time to install your brand new springs. So transfer the rubber pad that's on the top of the stock spring over to your new spring and then go ahead and drop it into the control arm. It should go in fairly easily, especially because it's slightly shorter. Get the spring seated properly in the bottom and then go ahead and align it with the top. And then use your floor jack to start to compress that spring and align it with the shock so you can get the bolts reinstalled. I started by replacing the end link bolt, then moving to the shock bolt, and then finally to the hub bolt. I went ahead and tightened these up in reverse order of what you just saw me install them in. So the hub assembly bolt, the shock bolt, and then the end link bolt. And the final step, just like with any assembly, is to go back to each of these nut and bolt pairs and make sure they're all torqued down to spec. That wraps up the rear spring install as well as the overall spring install itself. The rear springs took about a quarter of the time because, as you can see, the process was just way easier and there's a lot less parts and pieces to remove. So here's a side profile of the Sportwagen after the install of the H&R Sport Springs. And for a little bit more detail, here's a before and after of the stock springs versus the H&R Sport Springs. Alright, so that wraps up the install of the springs. Before we get into my first impressions on them, first a quick PSA. If you have a keen eye, you may have noticed something. Yeah, learn from my mistakes. Always take your time when jacking up and repositioning your car and using jack stands. And check to make sure nothing is in the way. I was trying to wrap this install up pretty quickly and started lowering the car before moving the jack stand completely out of the way, and I did some pretty nice body work to the side skirt. So don't be me, take your time. Back to the springs. So far, after driving about 500 miles or so, these H&R Springs have been exactly what I've been looking for. They're pretty darn comfortable for daily driving, yet firm enough to reduce a good amount of the body roll during cornering. Overall, now the car is very responsive to the inputs from both the gas pedal and from the steering wheel, and it's a heck of a lot of fun so far. If you have any questions about the install or the springs themselves, put them in the comments below. If you like this video, consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell to get alerted when my next video arrives. And I actually know what it's going to be. I'm also going to be installing an ECS street shield to help keep rocks and branches at bay, so check in to see that soon. Talk to you soon.